The Iron Dragon gym was less a building and more a living thing. It breathed with the rhythm of exertion. Its heartbeat, the steady thud of fists against heavy bags, and the rhythmic thumping of feet on the mats. The air itself was thick, a tangible soup of sweat, chalk dust, and the faint, sharp scent of disinfectant that never quite managed to win the war against the building's constant heat. On one wall, faded posters from old tournaments watched over the floor like grizzled veterans. On another, a wall of gleaming trophies caught the low light, a silent testament to the gym's culture of victory. This was a place for the loud, the strong, the fast. It was a place for showing off, and nobody showed off better than Kenji. At 25, he was the gym's crown prince, a living embodiment of the power the place cherished. His body was a map of dedication, every muscle carved and defined by countless hours of training. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, his presence instantly commanding the room's attention. When he demonstrated a technique, it wasn't just a lesson. It was a performance. He would flow through the motions, a spinning kick that ended with a deafening slap of his foot on the pad, a sharp punch that made the bag jump on its chain. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, and the younger students watched him with an awe that bordered on worship. They saw his confidence, his power, and they wanted it for themselves. Kenji knew he was being watched. He fed on it. It was the fuel that kept his engine running. During a class, he'd stop mid-explanation to point out a flaw in a student's stance, not to help them, but to subtly reinforce his own superior knowledge. No, like this, he'd say, effortlessly sliding into a perfect, low stance that made the student's clumsy attempt look like a child's drawing. His voice was firm, carrying over the gym's noise, and he always ended his corrections with a quick, sharp smile that was as much about his own satisfaction as it was about encouragement. The students, desperate for his approval, would try harder, their faces scrunched in concentration. He was the sun they all orbited, and the entire gym felt a little dimmer when he wasn't at its center. This particular afternoon, the gym was buzzing with its usual energy. A group of teenagers was practicing their forms in one corner, their movements awkward but earnest. In the center of the main mat, Kenji was working with his advanced class, demonstrating a complex takedown. He used one of his larger students as a partner, a muscular young man who probably thought he was strong until Kenji put his hands on him. With a simple shift of his hips and a tug on the sleeve, Kenji sent the bigger man flying, landing him softly on the mat with a loud hump. The class erupted in appreciative sounds. Kenji just grinned, placing his foot on the student's chest in a pose of victory. It was all for show, a small moment to reinforce the pecking order. He was the king, and they were his subjects. It was the natural order of things in this world of sweat and aggression. The heavy front door, always left slightly ajar for ventilation, creaked open, pulling a few eyes towards the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She didn't belong. It was obvious in a single glance. The gym was a sea of fit, young bodies in tight branded athletic gear. She wore a simple, faded tracksuit, the kind you could buy at any department store, soft and loose around her frame. Her hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe even her 60s. And her face was lined not with the harshness of age, but with a sort of gentle, quiet wisdom. She held a rolled-up yoga mat under one arm, like it was a comfortable, familiar friend. She didn't gawk or stare around like a newcomer lost and intimidated. Her eyes swept the room once, a calm, unhurried glance, and then she moved. Her steps were light and made no sound on the scuffed concrete floor. She ignored the grunts and shouts of the main class, walking past the clanking weight machines and the dangling speed bags. She found a small, forgotten corner of the gym, a patch of floor near the back, where the fluorescent lights was hummed a little more quietly, and the sound of the main action was muffled. It was a space no one ever used. Too far from the mirrors and too close to the storage closet. There, in the eye of the gym's roaring hurricane, she created a pocket of perfect silence. She unrolled her worn mat with a soft thwomp and stepped onto its center. The chaos of the gym seemed to bend around her as if an invisible shield had been raised. She began to stretch, but it was nothing like the explosive, goal-oriented stretching the fighters did. Her movements were slow, flowing, and deliberate. She would reach for the sky with a soft inhale, then fold forward with a long, slow exhale, her hands easily reaching the floor. She moved into a lunge, holding it not with strained muscle, but with a deep, settling stillness, as if she were growing roots into the mat. She wasn't preparing for a fight. It looked more like a dance, or a prayer. A personal conversation between her body and the floor. Kenji, having just finished his demonstration, caught sight of her. He nudged the student he had just thrown down, jerking his chin in the woman's direction. "Hey, check out Grandma over there," he said, his voice a low, amused whisper that carried to the others nearby. A few of his students turned, their brows furrowed in confusion before a look of understanding. And then amusement crossed their faces. One of them, a lanky boy of 17 who tried to mimic Kenji's every move, let out a snort. Kenji's grin widened. He loved being the one to point out the absurdities of the world, especially when it made him look even more important by comparison. "She must be lost," Kenji continued. Just loud enough for his small group to hear. "Maybe she's looking for the bridge club. Or a pottery class." He let out a short, sharp laugh. A few of his students joined in, their laughter a little too eager, a little too loud. They were laughing at the strange, quiet woman in the corner, but they were really performing for Kenji, seeking his approval. From his position of power, she looked ridiculous, an old woman doing slow-motion exercises in a temple of power and speed. The simple lady and her simple stretches were the perfect joke for a man who only understood one kind of strength. And like all jokes in a place like this, it was told at someone else's expense. The laughter from Kenji and his small crowd of students was like a stone thrown into a pond. It rippled through the gym, turning a few heads and pulling the focus of the room away from the grunts of effort and towards the spectacle in the corner. The laughter wasn't cruel, not really. It was the kind of thoughtless amusement that comes from a place of complete confidence. The giggling of those who have never had to question their place in the world. To them, the woman was a curious, out-of-place artifact in their modern museum of muscle. But for Kenji, the laughter wasn't enough. It was just the appetizer. He needed to prove to himself and to everyone else that his world was the only one that mattered. He peeled away from his group of students, a predator finally deciding to approach the unusual creature that had wandered into his territory. He moved with a swagger that was almost comical, his chest puffed out, his chin held high. He walked around the edge of the mat, his eyes locked on the woman, who still moved through her slow, flowing routine, completely oblivious, or even more insulting, completely uncaring. He stopped just a few feet from her, letting his shadow fall over her mat. A physical announcement of his presence. The woman. Aya was in the middle of a gentle twist, her body coiled like a slow-moving spring. She finished the movement, uncurling with a soft exhale, and then opened her eyes. She looked up at him, not with surprise or fear, but with a simple, neutral curiosity. As if he were just another piece of the gym's furniture she had yet to catalog. Her calm was a direct challenge to his energy, and it made him even more determined to break it. "Excuse me, ma'am," Kenji said. He put on his most charming, teacher-like voice, the one he used with parents or new potential students. But this time, it was laced with a thick coating of condescension. "This here is a training gym for serious martial arts. We wouldn't want you to get accidentally hurt by a flying bag or a stray kick." He gestured around him with a broad sweep of his arm, as if presenting her with a dangerous jungle. His students were watching, leaning in to catch every word, their smiles ready and waiting for their leader's punchline. Awaya simply looked at him, her gaze steady and clear. It wasn't a hard look, but it was a deep one. It felt like she was looking past the tight muscles and the loud voice, right into the empty space behind his eyes. After a moment that stretched just a little too long for comfort, she spoke. Her voice was soft, a little raspy from age, but it carried a surprising weight. "I am quite comfortable, thank you," she said. She didn't raise her voice or get defensive. She stated it as a simple fact, like saying the sky was blue. Her complete lack of reaction was like oil on the fire of Kenji's ego. He had expected her to be flustered, to apologize and pack up her mat. He had expected her to recognize his authority and the authority of the gym. Instead, she had just dismissed him. It was the calmest, most effective insult he had ever received. A hot flush of anger crept up his neck. He couldn't just walk away now. That would be a defeat, and Kenji did not lose. You know, it's not safe, he pushed, taking a half-step closer, trying to loom over her. This isn't a park. People are here to work, to really push themselves. He gestured to his students, who nodded in solemn agreement, playing their parts perfectly. We're here to get stronger, faster, to be the best. What you're doing? That's just relaxing. It doesn't belong here. Aya finally moved from her seated position. She stood up, a fluid motion that required no apparent effort. She wasn't tall, maybe a couple of inches shorter than him. But when she stood facing him, she seemed to take up more space than he did. He was all hard angles, intense energy. She was all quiet, centered stillness. Perhaps strength has more than one definition, she said softly, her eyes still fixed on his. That was it. That was the line that broke through his thin skin. Strength. Strength is this, he barked, his voice losing its fake charm and revealing its raw, aggressive edge. He suddenly launched into a demonstration right there on the spot. He exploded into a series of sharp, showy movements. A blindingly fast roundhouse kick that sliced the air just inches from a weight rack. A powerful punch that stopped a hair's breadth from a hanging heavy bag, making it sway violently. He finished with a loud, sharp shout that made a few of the younger students jump. He was putting on a show, a symphony of power and speed, all meant to intimidate this one quiet woman. He looked directly at her, his chest heaving, his eyes challenging her to be impressed. She didn't even flinch. Her expression didn't change. She just watched him, her head tilted slightly. As a scientist might observe a particularly loud and volatile insect in a lab experiment, her complete indifference was the ultimate humiliation. It was one thing to be ignored, but it was another to be loud and powerful and still be completely irrelevant. His anger now had nowhere else to go. He was breathing hard, not from exhaustion, but from pure, unfiltered frustration. He was a black belt, a champion, and he was being made to feel like a tantrum-throwing child by a woman in a tracksuit. He had to end this. He had to prove his superiority, not with flashy moves, but with a direct challenge that she could not possibly accept. "All right," he said, his voice a low growl. He looked around at his audience, ensuring they were all watching. "Let's make this interesting. You think your slow, quiet way is something? Fine, show me." He took a wide, powerful stance, planting his feet firmly. He held his hands up, open in a gesture that was both an invitation and a mockery. "Just one touch. If you can lay a single finger on me, just one, I will personally bow to you. And I will clean your shoes every single day for a month." In front of everyone, the gym fell silent. The playful laughter died in their throats. This had gone from a light-hearted joke to a serious confrontation. The students looked at each other, their smiles replaced by uneasy glances. This felt wrong. Challenging an old woman, a complete stranger, in front of the entire gym? It was bullying. But no one dared to say anything. Kenji was their king, and this was his royal decree. Aya stood perfectly still. She looked from Kenji's smug, challenging face to the crowd of silent students, and then back to him. She let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, the weight of it pressing down on everyone. She was not a fighter. She was not an entertainer. She was just a woman who had come to the gym for a moment of quiet. But Kenji, in his arrogance, had backed her into a corner where quiet was no longer an option. He had forced her hand. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, a quiet breath of resignation. It was the sigh of someone who has been arguing with a stubborn child and has finally realized that words are useless. With a single simple nod, she accepted. She walked to the very center of the main mat, the spotlight she had never wanted now shining directly on her. The center of the mat was a different world. It was the gym's stage, the place where tests were passed and reputations were forged. The scuff marks on the blue canvas were a record of 1,000 fights, 1,000 falls, 1,000 moments of triumph and defeat. Stepping into that circle was a statement. When Aya walked to its center, she did not look like a fighter entering a battle. She looked like someone stepping into a quiet room and closing the door behind her. She didn't adopt a fighting stance. There was no tension in her shoulders, no bend in her knees. She just stood there, her feet flat on the floor, shoulder width apart. Her hands resting loosely at her sides, her fingers slightly curled. She looked completely and utterly normal. Kenji, on the other hand, looked like a coiled spring. He bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, a tiny, energetic motion that spoke of his readiness, of the power thrumming just beneath his skin. He circled her slowly, a predator, looking for an opening in a prey that seemed to have no defenses at all. The smirk was back on his face, but it was different now. It was colder, more focused. He was done playing games. This was the final act of his little drama, and he was going to make sure the ending was exactly as he had written it. He planned to rush her, grab her wrist in an unbreakable grip, and gently but firmly guide her to the mat. It would be a quick, clean, and utterly humiliating end to this charade. He would be powerful but merciful, the magnanimous king letting the jester know her place. Awaya did not watch him circle. Her gaze was fixed on a point on the wall just behind him, as if she were looking at something far, far away. She seemed disconnected from the moment, from the dozen pairs of eyes watching her, from the man preparing to attack her. She was a portrait of stillness in a room full of nervous energy. The silence of the gym deepened. The only sounds were the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the faint, rhythmic squeak of Kenji's shoes on the mat as he continued his slow circle. The students held their breath. They felt a strange, collective unease. The feeling you get when you watch a domino wobble, knowing it's about to fall, but not knowing how many others it will take down with it. Kenji grew impatient. The waiting was eating at the theatricality of the moment. He wanted the action, the climax. He decided his plan of a gentle takedown was too slow. He would lunge, grab her arm, spin her around, and end it before she even knew what was happening. He stopped circling and faced her directly. He feinted with his left shoulder, a little trick to see if she would flinch. She didn't. Her body remained as still as a statue. This lack of reaction only cemented his decision. He would end it now. "All right, here I come," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was meant for her, but was heard by everyone. He planted his back foot and exploded forward. It was a demonstration of pure athletic power. He shot across the small space between them, his right hand shooting out, not to strike, but to seize. His goal was her wrist, a simple, effective control point. He expected to feel the small, soft bones of her arm under his grip. He expected to feel her resistance, her struggle. He did not feel her arm. At the exact instant his hand was about to make contact, Aya moved. It was not a dodge or a block in the way the gym understood it. Her movement was almost impossibly small. She didn't jump back or throw up her arms. It was more like she just wasn't there anymore. With a simple pivot on her right foot, she turned her body a few inches to her left. It was a movement so subtle, it looked like she had merely shifted her weight. Her left hand, which had been hanging at her side, rose in a soft upward arc. Her palm met the inside of his lunging wrist. There was no impact. There was no slap. There was no sound at all. Her touch was impossibly gentle. It was not a strike or a shove. It was a redirection, a physical conversation. As his momentum carried him forward, her palm guided his hand. Not against it, but with it. She helped him. She took the force he was so eager to give her, and with a touch as light as a butterfly's wing, sent it on a new, harmless trajectory. His hand, which had been aimed at her center, now shot past her side, clawing at empty air. For a split second, Kenji's brain couldn't process what had happened. He was committed to the lunge. His body was a missile, but its target had vanished. His forward momentum, which he had intended to be a weapon, was now his downfall. He was off balance, stumbling forward, his arm flailing. He was a cartoon character who had run off a cliff and was just now realizing there was nothing beneath his feet. And as he stumbled past her, she moved again. She was already turned, her body perfectly aligned with his. As his head came forward, her other hand, which had been hanging at her side, came up. It was just as slow, just as graceful. Her arm extended, and the index and middle fingers of her right hand reached out towards him. They moved with a terrifying slowness, a deliberate pace that made the entire room feel like it was moving in slow motion. Kenji's eyes, wide with confusion and panic, saw the fingers coming. He saw them getting closer, but his body, locked in its forward stumble, was completely powerless to stop them. Then they made contact. It was the softest, most delicate touch the gym had ever known. The two fingers landed with the quiet precision of a watchmaker placing a gear. They tapped a specific spot on the back of his neck, right at the base of his skull. It wasn't a push. It wasn't a pinch. It was a tap. It was the kind of touch you would use to get someone's attention in a library. And the world stopped. Kenji froze. It was not a voluntary freeze. His body simply stopped obeying his brain. His foot, which was about to take another step forward, remained glued to the mat. His arm, which was flailing in the air, locked in place. His lungs, which were about to draw a sharp breath, refused to work. He was a statue carved from a moment of pure kinetic energy. His face was a perfect mask of shock, his eyes wide and staring at the wall in front of him. His mouth slightly open as if to ask a question. He no longer had the breath to speak. The gym was plunged into a silence so profound it was deafening. No one breathed. No one moved. They stared at the impossible scene in front of them, their arrogant, powerful champion, completely and utterly immobilized by a single, gentle tap from a woman in a tracksuit. The joke was over. The performance was done, and the audience was left staring at a reality that made no sense. AYA. Her movements still unhurried and calm, let her hand drop back to her side. She took a slow, deep breath, the only person in the room who seemed to be in control of her own body. She looked at Kenji's frozen form not with triumph or anger, but with a kind of quiet pity. It was the look of a teacher who had just given a very stubborn student a lesson he would never, ever forget. The silence that fell over the Iron Dragon gym was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, solid thing, thick with unspoken questions and dawning disbelief. The air, which had been so full of energy and noise just moments before, now felt still and cold. Every single person in the room was frozen in place, their eyes locked on the scene in the center of the mat. Their minds were struggling, trying to fit what they were seeing into the world they thought they understood. It was like watching a video on loop, a glitch in reality that made no sense. Kenji, the whirlwind of power, the center of their universe, was just stopped. A statue. And Aya, the quiet, unassuming woman, is the only thing in the room that seemed to be moving with any purpose. The expression on Kenji's face was the most horrifying and fascinating thing of all. It was a mask of pure, undiluted shock. His eyes, usually so full of confidence and fire, were wide and staring, fixed on a point on the far wall, but seeing nothing. His jaw was slack, his mouth slightly open. The smirk, the arrogance, the cocky power it had all been wiped clean, leaving behind only the raw, primal fear of a creature that had suddenly discovered it was not at the top of the food chain. He was a ship that had run into an iceberg it never saw coming. And now he was sinking not into water, but into an icy, paralyzing void. Awaya stood beside his frozen form for a moment, her gaze soft. There was no trace of victory on her face, no smug smile, no sense of a battle won. She looked at him as one might look at a powerful but foolish child who had finally touched a hot stove after being told not to. Her calmness was more unnerving than any shout or aggressive pose could ever be. It was a complete and total emotional disconnect from the drama she had just created. She had not reacted. She had simply acted. And now, the consequence of that action was hanging in the air. It's a silent and terrifying testament to a kind of power no one in the room had ever conceived of. Finally, she moved. She did not look at the other students, did not acknowledge their stunned silence. She simply walked around Kenji's rigid body as if it were a piece of furniture she had to navigate. Her steps were still completely silent, the soles of her simple shoes making no sound on the mat. As she passed him, she spoke. Her voice was still soft, still raspy, but in the dead quiet of the gym, it carried the force of a thunderclap. "The true art," she said. Her words slow and deliberate, each one landing with perfect clarity, "is not in how much force you can give out." She paused on the other side of him, turning to look at his profile at the vacant look in his eyes. The students, as one, followed her gaze, their own minds replaying the impossible move they had just witnessed. They had all seen Kenji lunge, all seen him miss, all seen the gentle touch that had followed. But their brains were still struggling to accept it as real. "It is in how perfectly you can receive," she continued, her voice unwavering, "and redirect the force that is given to you." Her words were a direct challenge to everything the gym stood for. They were a lecture delivered without a single raised voice, a philosophy lesson taught through a single, impossible action. Their entire world was built on the idea of being stronger, faster, tougher. It was about overpowering the opponent. Aya had just shown them a completely different path, a path that required no brute strength, no athletic prowess, no aggression. It was a path of understanding and control. A path so advanced it looked like magic. She stood there for another long moment, letting the words sink in, letting the image of her gentle touch and his frozen form burn itself into the memory of every single person watching. She was not just teaching them a lesson. She was rewriting their understanding of what power even was. Then, with a movement as economical and graceful as everything else she had done, she reached out again. This time, her hand was open. She placed her palm flat on the center of his upper back between his shoulder blades. The touch was just as light as the one on his neck, just as deliberate. She held it there for a second, a simple, resting pressure, and then Kenji's body released. It was not a collapse. It was a deflation. It was as if someone had pulled a plug and all the tension, all the rigid energy that had been holding him upright, suddenly drained away. His knees buckled, his legs gave out from under him, and he crumpled to the mat. He didn't fall forward or backward. He just went down, folding into himself. He landed hard on his knees, his upper body slumping forward, his head hanging down, his forehead almost touching the canvas. A loud, ragged gasp tore from his throat, the first sound he had made since he lunged. It was the sound of a man drowning and finally tasting air. He began to suck in huge, desperate breaths, his body trembling, his shoulders shaking. Awaya watched him crumple, her expression unchanged. She had done what she came to do. She had answered his arrogance not with anger, but with a lesson. She had shown him, and everyone else, the emptiness of his pride. She did not wait for him to recover. She did not wait for the applause that was not coming, or the questions that were hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She simply turned her back on the scene and walked away. She walked with the same unhurried, quiet pace she had when she first arrived. She went to her corner, picked up her worn yoga mat, and rolled it up with the same simple, practiced motion. The students in the gym watched her every step, their bodies still tense, their minds reeling. No one made a sound. They were like villagers who had just witnessed a deity walk through their town. They were now left to grapple with the reality of what they had seen. Aya reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped out of the gym and back into the ordinary afternoon sun, leaving behind a room full of people whose entire world had just been turned upside down. The heavy door swung shut behind her with a soft final click, sealing them in with the ringing silence and the sobbing sounds of their broken king. The sound of the door clicking shut was the final, quiet punctuation mark on a story no one could yet believe. For a long time, the only sound in the Iron Dragon gym was the shuddering, uneven breathing of the man kneeling on the mat. Kenji was no longer a king on a throne of muscle and pride. He was a man broken not by a fist or a foot, but by a single, gentle touch that had dismantled his entire reality. He remained on his knees, his forehead pressed to the cool canvas, the gritty smell of the mat filling his senses. He wasn't crying. Not yet. He was just broken. A vessel that had been full to the brim with arrogance and confidence was now empty. And the echoing hollow inside him was the most painful thing he had ever felt. The students stood frozen, their bodies still locked in the poses they had been in when the impossible happened. They were a gallery of statues. The lanky teenager who had mimicked Kenji's every move now looked at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The larger student who had been thrown with such ease just moments before now felt the shame of his own boasts. Turning to ash in his mouth, no one knew what to do. Do they help him? Do they walk away? Do they pretend this never happened? The social order had been vaporized, and in its place was a thick, choking uncertainty. They looked at each other, their eyes asking the questions their voices could not. But no one had the answers. Finally, one person moved. It was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, who had been training at the gym for as long as anyone could remember. His hair was silver, and his body, while still fit, carried the softness of age. He had been quietly working on a bag in the corner during the whole event, silent observer who had seen countless young champions come and go. His name was Thomas, and he had a quiet wisdom about him that had always earned him a grudging respect. Even from Kenji, he walked slowly, deliberately across the mat. He did not approach Kenji with pity or with a desire to lecture. He simply came to stand beside him, a silent presence offering a quiet anchor in a storm of confusion. Kenji didn't look up. He just knelt there, the tremors slowly subsiding, replaced by a deep, heavy stillness. The other students watched as Thomas knelt down beside their fallen leader, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was a gesture of simple human connection, a stark contrast to the aggressive energy that usually filled the room. Thomas spoke, his voice low and calm, meant only for Kenji's ears. "Do you know who that was?" Kenji gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He couldn't find the words. "That was Aya Tanaka," Thomas said, his voice carrying a weight that made the few students closest to them lean in, trying to hear. "She was the sole student of Master Hideo, the man who founded our style of fighting. Decades ago, before this gym was even built, before any of us were born." Kenji finally lifted his head, his face pale and streaked with the effort of his collapse. He looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. "They say," Thomas continued, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back through time, "that she was the most gifted fighter he ever saw. It wasn't just her technique, it was her spirit. She never sought a fight, but she never lost one. Not in 30 years of tournaments. Not in the quiet, private matches with masters who came from all over the world to test her. They say she was untouchable." He paused, letting the words settle. "She retired decades ago. Some say she just grew tired of the world of competition, of the endless quest for bigger trophies and louder cheers. Others say she believed the world had forgotten the true meaning of the art, the philosophy behind the punch. She was looking for respect, not victory. She stepped away because she felt there was nothing left for her to learn in a place that only valued winning." Thomas looked around the gym, at the trophies, at the mirrors, at the faces of the young students who were now listening with rapt attention. "She came here today not to fight, but for a moment of peace. And you? You offered her a fight. You offered her a joke." He looked back at Kenji, his expression not angry, but deeply sad. "She didn't hurt you, son." "Not really. She just reminded you of the difference between a fighter and a martial artist. And she showed us all what that difference is." With that, Thomas patted Kenji's shoulder once more and stood up, leaving the young man to his thoughts. The gym slowly came back to life, but it was a different kind of life. No one went back to their bags or the weights. They gathered in small, quiet groups, talking in hushed tones, the story already being retold, each telling more unbelievable than the last. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. Kenji stayed on his knees for a long time after everyone else had gone home. The gym was empty, the lights casting long, lonely shadows across the floor. He looked at his reflection in the large mirror on the wall, but he didn't see the champion he was that morning. He saw a fool, a loud, empty shell of a man who had been measured and found wanting. The shame was a physical ache in his chest, but beneath it, something new was beginning to grow. It was a seed of understanding, planted by Aya's gentle touch and watered by Thomas's quiet words. The next day, Kenji arrived at the gym before anyone else. He did not wear his usual cocky grin. He walked with a new quietness, a new deliberateness. He went to the trophy wall, the one he had polished and preened over countless times. He looked at the golden statues and the engraved plaques, and for the first time, he saw them for what they were, lumps of metal that measured moments of aggression, not of understanding. One by one, he took them down. Carefully wrapping them in old towels and placing them in a cardboard box he found in the storage closet, he emptied the entire wall when the first students arrived. They were shocked to see the bare wall and their instructor sitting quietly on the mat, meditating. He didn't teach a spinning kick or a powerful punch that day. He talked about balance. He talked about respect. He talked about the journey of self-discovery that was hidden inside the journey of combat. He spoke in a soft, humble voice, and every single person in that room listened with an intensity they had never had before. Kenji was a different man. The change was not immediate or easy. There were days he had to fight the old urge to show off, to prove his worth with force. But now, when that urge came, he would remember the feel of Aya's hand on his neck, the feeling of his own body betraying him. He would remember her words about receiving force, not just giving it. He began to truly teach, not just to show. He learned his students' names, not just their weaknesses. He praised effort over victory. The Iron Dragon Gym slowly transformed from a temple of power into a place of learning, and the story of the quiet lady and her one perfect move became its most important lesson. A legend whispered to newcomers who might come in with too much swagger. It was a story told not to shame, but to guide, a permanent reminder that the most powerful presence in any room is often the quietest one, and that true mastery needs no announcement.